Hello everyone, this is Tyler here. It is the end of December and Talon here, and I'm going to discuss with everyone here what Japan can teach us about MGTOW and what we can see from Japan, the trends that have occurred there and how it's relevant for other countries, especially Western countries. So many people here may understand that Japan has had a very interesting history. I mean, in the past 30 to 40 years, there's been huge change in the country. It's gone from being it was obviously a war-torn country to very industrialized to becoming very prosperous, and then pretty much from that point being on the decline economically and population-wise. And it's really a sad sign, but there's definitely, I think, some lessons here for MGTOW guys, and also things that countries have to be careful with when looking at these kind of situations. Japan obviously has had a trend now since like the early 90s that basically was pre-MGTOW before most other countries were aware of this, and they didn't really even have a term for it. They were essentially living this way, or in an incel lifestyle, way before this was even well known in the US or Canada. Japan, obviously, technology-wise, was very much at the forefront in the world, and I think they have been one of the most developed countries now for some time in the world. Very high IQ population, intelligent population, and they have always been in a leader in certain areas like in automotive and electronics and certain aspects of engineering. This has been good and bad. I mean, just like in other countries. But when it comes to the lessons that I can teach MGTOW guys, I think it's very important here. Unfortunately, Japan is a case where it became a very MGTOW-like country, but unlike in Western countries like in Europe and whatnot, many guys just decided to stay in Japan. They didn't leave, and that's the interesting thing. Whereas like in Europe, in parts of Europe and North America, guys and Australia have decided to leave, or have left, or will leave. I myself left. This is maybe also due to certain trends in terms of like how certain groups are being more favored in Western countries over other groups, and it probably made it a bit easier in places like the US and Canada for guys to just simply be fed up with it and leave. I think maybe in Japan there wasn't this same kind of discriminatory practices against certain groups, so guys maybe felt that they were benefiting economically and it was just too uncomfortable to leave. In my own case, I mean, of the places I've lived, I in general feel way more comfortable here in Estonia and also in Russia than when I was living in Chicago. I didn't even look like people when I lived in Chicago. Like here in Estonia, a lot of people don't even know that I'm foreign here. It's very interesting when I think about this, that this is a foreign country, but I look more similar to people here than I did in my home country, in my home city, Chicago. And many guys don't feel like foreigners in their own country. Unlike in Japan, where I don't think most guys, even though it was a very subpar dating climate there, they didn't feel like foreign people. And this is a vital difference here. And this is actually one of the reasons I think why it's much more difficult. I mean, there's not a lot of Japanese guys percentage-wise that have just had enough of it and have left. This is not like a common practice in Japan like it was in other countries. It occurred at such a time that economically it was still so good in Japan. I mean, if we go back to the 90s, there wasn't as much motive to leave. It maybe didn't seem like enough reason for and also, of course, at that point in time, people were very well tied to their communities with family and friends. And like I said, Japan, very nationalistic, a very, I would say, close culture type of country to foreigners, from what I've read. They certainly are receptive to travelers, tourists, but I think when it comes to actually living there, like long term, I don't think they're as receptive to the ideal. And I've read about stories where they'll actually have store shops in places where they'll say no foreigners allowed in here. Maybe this isn't an issue right now because of this crisis. I think a lot of businesses will take anyone, which maybe this has changed a bit right now, but it kind of tells you the mentality with this country. It's very much, like I say about Estonia, it's very much a country made by and for Japanese people, and this is kind of the difference when we look at like countries like US and Canada. In Australia, not really made as a country by and for the men in these countries, especially men that are from European-based backgrounds. We often feel like more of outsiders than anyone in our home countries. It's crazy. Whereas in Japan, it's not like the typical Japanese guy that go into the workplace or apply for a job in the mid-90s. They wouldn't be looked at any differently. There wasn't like a subpar status. So unlike maybe a typical guy from the US, they don't fit their quota that they need at that workplace, especially in the public sector. They're going to give them a very slim chance of being selected for a job, even if they're more qualified. This is just what it is. This is always a mindset difference, obviously, I think. And also, one of the other things is, I know not some MGTOW guys obviously prefer to be by themselves, to be level 4, level 5 MGTOW, which means total seclusion, total isolation by yourself. Akin to someone like Ted Kaczynski. I would say Ted Kaczynski was like a level 5 MGTOW guy. On the other hand, the guys that are like lower in levels, they may engage in relationships, and I've known of MGTOW guys that actually were in relationships, long-term relationships, and even married. Some guys may ask me how you could be married in MGTOW. Well, very simple. Someone may have gotten married a long time ago, for whatever reason, still remain in the marriage, even though they weren't very closely tied to their wife at that time. And because of probably financial reasons, they couldn't exit the marriage, or it was just better for their bottom line to stay in that marriage, even though there likely was not intimacy at that point. There also are situations, and some guys may not identify these as MGTOW guys, where they'll get married, they'll go to a foreign country, the country suits them that they can still live the life they prefer and have kids and stuff. And this is a fundamental difference to like Japanese guys. I think many of the Japanese guys were not as keen on essentially on getting married or having any kind of relationships, whether that was at home or abroad. And I think too, it's tied to their SMB. But what Japan has taught us though is that when we look at the philosophy here, is that we cannot let a country go to the wayside. And that's one of the biggest problems here that I saw with Japan. Even though I think it was a very MGTOW country ahead of its time, it was, some people would argue and say it was more of an incel country. They let their country go too much to the wayside. And Japan, of course, still has their government in place, still wants to keep them mostly Japanese, which is a problem because they obviously don't have a population replacement rate. But at the same time, they have an aging population that is simply a huge financial burden on the government and on the country.